As video games push the envelope in terms of realism and mature subject matter, some groups think it's necessary to push back. Concerned parents, overzealous lawyers, and Bible-thumping politicians have kept the ESRB extremely busy with claims that games are destroying the youth. Is there a direct link between video games and adolescent behavioral problems? And what are today's teenagers really playing? Dr. Lawrence Kutner and Cheryl Olson, writers of the research book Grand Theft Childhood, are here to share their findings. Joining us today are the directors and co-founders of the Harvard Medical School Center for Mental Health and Media and authors of the newly released book, Grand Theft Childhood, Dr. Lawrence Kutner and Dr. Cheryl Olson. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you again for this extensive research that you've done on a subject that's obviously very close to me and many of our viewers out there.
Well, it's a pleasure.
Our pleasure.
So I guess just sort of a quick summary of what has obviously been some rather exhaustive research. What is kind of the sense of the study that you did and the conclusions that you drew from it?
Well, we did a study that lasted several years. It was funded by the U.S. Department of Justice for about $1.5 million. And we wound up surveying and interviewing over 1,250 kids in multiple states and 500 of their parents. And a couple of things really are the top takeaways from that. One of them is that the big concern that you hear the politicians and the pundits argue that playing violent video games will somehow turn your child into a criminal or a violent person. There's absolutely no evidence for that. If you look at violent crime in the U.S. over the past 20 years among teenagers, it's gone down and gone down significantly. And if you look at video game play, it's gone up and gone up significantly. But there are some patterns of play that parents and teachers maybe they should take a little closer look at.
One of the big things we did in our research is try to figure out what's normal and what's not. Amazingly, that hadn't really been established before in the research literature.
Now, obviously, that brings up a good question, because even though the politicians like to make hay out of this matter, there are all these studies that they can cite that really try to show this, quick causality between violent games and violent behavior. Why do those studies exist, and why are they getting any credit at all?
There seems to be a core of experimental psychologists who've really grabbed the headlines on this topic. They tend to take college students, in Psych 101, and they pay them a little bit or give them some course credit, and they have them play a violent or a non-violent game for 15 or 20 minutes, and then they have them do something like blast an air horn or give a little shock to someone who they can't see in another room. And they try to say that aggression in the real world is the same as aggression in the lab, where they're blasting an air horn for a fraction of a second longer. And people who don't know about the research, they're not able to go back and look this stuff up and say, does this really make sense? Is this anything like aggression in the real world? And we don't think it is.
Well, there's another issue, which is short-term versus long-term. If you go to the local Cineplex and there's a Jackie Chan movie or a Jet Li movie, and you watch a bunch of teenagers come out of that, of course they're going to be sort of hitting each other and kicking, and they're excited. But that goes away very quickly. And so there's this leap of faith that if a child or a teenager or even a young adult is exposed to this and they have a short-term response, that means it's going to change their behavior. And we found actually quite the opposite. One of the surprising things we found, if you wanted to look at which kids are at greatest risk for getting into trouble, for being trouble with the school, for getting into fights, that sort of thing, we found that at two extremes for the boys, one extreme for the girls. For both the boys and girls, if you play almost exclusively M-rated or violent video games, play for more than 15 hours a week, then you're at greater risk for getting into trouble. Now, still, most of the kids who do that don't, but you are at statistically greater risk.
It's what we call a risk marker. It doesn't mean it's causing it.
But with the boys, what we found is those boys who did not play video games at all were also at significantly greater risk for getting into trouble.
They had more school problems and fights.
It seems that playing video games for boys is a marker of social competence. And that surprised us. And what was interesting, when you look at what happened almost a year ago at Virginia Tech, and you had Sung-Mi Cho, actually. And initially, all the pundits went on the air and they said, well, it's caused by violent video games. If you look at the actual report, video games are mentioned 3 times in that report. One, it says that when he was 9 years old, he used to play Sonic the Hedgehog. And he didn't play violent video games then. But the other times, it's his suite mates, the kids he shared a dorm room with, who said that he didn't play video games at all. And that struck them as really odd because everyone else did. And that fell right in line with our research findings, that the kids who don't play it at all are actually at greater risk for getting into trouble. It says something about their social relationships.
Given that you've shown that games really aren't as damaging as people claim they are, and they may actually have some beneficial roles for young males, what do you think really is the role of video games in society going forward?
Well, it's interesting that they're called games because in many ways they're simulations. They're much more mature than what we think of most games being. I think they're an opportunity for kids and for adults to test new skills, to explore new worlds, to try new environments, to see what they're like in an environment that is not critical of them, where they can make mistakes, recover, and practice for the real world.
Also, the new game systems like the Wii make it easier for parents to get involved. We find that kids really want to play with their parents, and they want to teach their parents. That's a great thing for a kid to take the chance to teach instead of always being told what to do.
I could not agree with you guys more. Thank you so much for coming by. This has been a fascinating discussion. I highly recommend to everyone out there to read Grand Theft Childhood. It is in stores today.